So we're really lucky today because he's a man in demand. Saad's agreed to have a little chat with me, and then we're going to open it up for 30 minutes for you guys to actually talk to him. Saad's really interesting because he's had a bit of experience in international markets, and to flow on the conversation from the last round table, we can actually talk a little bit about, you know, what difference is it here in the Silicon Valley? Why has this incredible ecosystem so rich? I've had a business in Ireland, and I lived in London, and I'm originally Australian, and I've just never come across the richness of talent, ideas, smart people as I found here. So I'm hoping that Saad's going to give his perspective, and maybe we can all discuss that. And also about what it's like to be in a foreign country, not Silicon Valley, or even out of state, and be trying to raise investment and what the ecosystems are like. And obviously we've still got Kevin here, so he can contribute about Canada. And I think I saw a GOSA. So hopefully we have a bit of feedback from VCs that are still with us. Thank you, Saad. Saad's recently just had his first child via his wife. So he's been a bit hard.
I did all the work.
So he's been a bit hard to get, so I'm thrilled to have him here. So Saad, tell me a little bit about how it has been for you. Obviously, you know, you're Pakistani origin, and you've seen a few international markets. I think I heard last time you spoke that you've looked at the Middle East.
Yeah, and I'm happy to walk you through all that stuff. I'm just kind of curious level set because you had this great conversation before, and I wasn't a part of it, and I'd love to hear what your highlights were in that context too, and then I'm happy to build on that and talk about my own experiences too. But
so would people like to give a few highlights of what they got out of the last round table?
I hear Igos as an incredible speaker.
Yeah.
On the screen, I was saying.
He always is. Any highlights that you took away from the last round table?
The importance of making sure you know who's giving you money and realizing that it's just important for you to put them on the pressure cooker as them. So, and the mutual belief.
Due diligence and asking for referrals from other entrepreneurs that are in their portfolio.
But also that they have the passion for what they're doing is important. It's not just a bank.
Mm-hmm. Or a real estate deal.
Yeah, exactly. They get it. They have to get it.
Anything else that you took away from the last round table?
The relation between the venture capitalists and the entrepreneurs.
The importance of communication between the CEO and the investors while managing the board.
Yeah.
And the ignorance of both.
Well said. That's awesome. Are there particular parts of the world that you guys are interested in terms of places where you're doing business, or are you trying to do business here or in other places? I'm assuming. I know some of you are sort of from all over. I recognize some faces, but.
Some people from the Middle East.
Yeah.
I think he met all of them.
Yeah. Awesome.
I have a question or something to ponder as you're talking, and that is, if you're launching a global company that plans on doing business in sort of every major market in the world, how do you approach the financing of that? You know, do you multitask it around the world? Do you focus? What do you do?
You come to the Valley, you pick up loads of money.
Besides that, is there an alternative to that? You know, just asking.
Okay. That's great. Let me tell you a little about my background, and then give some context to get started. So my background, I'm from Pakistan originally. I actually moved here to go to Stanford, and I've kind of hung out here since. I have family back there. My dad was an engineer. I grew up in a combination between the Valley and Pakistan, so I went back and forth a lot. My sort of, from a venture perspective, I noticed somebody had the Art of the Start floating around. I actually worked with Guy Kawasaki for a long time at something called Garage.com, which was like Incubator 1.0, back when it still cost $10 million to put together a consumer web product. Remember those days? Build data centers, the cloud wasn't a thing. and for the last 7 years, I've been at a firm called CMEA Capital, which is sort of a mid-sized venture firm, $1.2 billion of assets under management. Last fund was a $400 million fund where I'm like the digital media web guy who wears hoodies and sneakers everywhere. But the firm does a lot of things in energy materials, life sciences, tech. I've done a number of other things I think that relate to this. I actually teach at the design school at Stanford occasionally, or in the Liberation Technology program, how you leverage tech to do good in the world. I spent the Middle East happens to be an area I spent a fair amount of time, primarily because I have a lot of friends in the Middle East. A few asked me to come talk about what was happening with like the Valley entrepreneurship scene, and next thing I knew, I was actually got involved with the State Department, coming on delegations to meet sort of heads of state and entrepreneurs coming out of labs from Turkey, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, into Jordan, all over the Gulf, Beirut. It's just been this kind of fun, awesome tour, and it's really interesting to hear what different people's sort of hot buttons are, and what's interesting, and also what areas are interesting for them to innovate on. I hosted a startup weekend in Egypt in post-revolution, which was pretty awesome, and I'll tell you a story that came out of that because it was just one of these things that I think has changed me. And so, so I'm happy to address any and all of those things, and if folks have questions about like how to do business, or specifically from your markets too, I'm happy to tell you what I see. I'll start with just a quick story, which to me just kind of shows sort of how small a world we live in. So when I was hosting the startup weekend in Egypt a few years back, this is I think 2011, just after the revolution, it was actually a pretty amazing day because I think the startup weekend started on a Friday, and it turned out that, if you know how startup weekends work, you basically come up and then you pitch your idea. First you have to recruit a team to come do whatever it is that you want to do. When they were actually recruiting their teams, Facebook F8 was happening in the Valley, and it was evening there, it was morning here, and so Facebook was releasing a bunch of new things. Timeline came out, the Open Graph came out, a number of other things that sort of were happening that were literally changing the pitches that we were hearing in Egypt in real time to incorporate the new features that were coming out. And it was just an incredible weekend because, and people actually started hacking on all those things over the course of the weekend. What was really sort of revealing to me is, I met this one kid who had actually won Startup Weekend in Cairo. He's probably 19 years old at the time. Anyway, he pitched his idea. He had way too much swagger for somebody who was 19. It was just like, it was pretty amazing. So, I had a conversation with him about stuff, just about what startup life was like and coming out to the Valley, et cetera. Fast forward 2 years, he actually, I found out that he was actually in the Valley because I got a call from one of my CEOs out here. Said, hey, we finally found somebody to help us with the product UI, UX stuff. We've been looking forever. It's taken forever to find someone. We finally got him. He tells me that he knows you. Like, can you please sell him on joining our company? And so I said, sure, no problem. Who is it? And it's the same guy. His name is Marwan. And it turns out that he had managed to basically come with a software development company out here for a while, managed to stick around here, gotten to know the Valley really well, became a hot commodity here from a talent perspective. I started talking to him about, what have you been doing? He's like, one of the reasons I came out here was because of this conversation we had 2 years ago. And, now I'm thinking about whether I want to join this or start my own company. Well, he, probably about 6 months ago, actually decided not to join that company, started his own, and I got to invest in this company here, which was it was pretty awesome, sort of full circle. And to me, it just kind of shows that, with an internet connection, you could really be anywhere and do anything. In his case, he chose to come out here, and I think he wants to go back to Egypt with it. So I've been humbled by a lot of these experiences. I'm excited to hear and meet you guys and see what you guys are up to as well.
Great. And so do you want to give me a little bit of perspective about how you see Silicon Valley in the perspective of the world, and why this has been such a hotbed? Talent, smarts.
This is such a huge question, right?
Yeah.
It's like a question that books have been written about. Yeah. It's a question that actually, nearby cities in California are asked people in Silicon Valley, why can't we be more like this?
Yeah. But what's your perspective? You must have some ideas.
Yeah, I think people sort of talk about different things, right? So one of the things in a lot of these State Department trips people talk about is the culture of Silicon Valley, which I think there's something to it. you know, sort of the fear of failure is not as big a deal here. People talk about. I actually think that's kind of bullshit, by the way. I think people are scared to fail everywhere. It's just the case that people here talk about their failures once they're successful. That's the difference, right? Everywhere else, no one even talks about that. But over here, it's like, oh yeah. You know, once I've had my IPO, everyone will tell you all the things that they got wrong. But no one tells you when they're actually pitching in real time.
That's right, actually, at FailCon, they're all successful entrepreneurs that talk about their failures.
I mean, it's easy to reflect back, you know, once you sort of have that, right? It's hard to do it, when, you know, when you're like, actually, like my last company sucked, and this one is like going horribly, and I just fired my co-founder, and I have no idea what to do. Like, you know, that conversation doesn't happen. People don't brag about that.
No, yeah.
But, you know, I think there's a lot of different things, obviously. To me, like, the one thing that's always stuck out here is community. It's just, it's something that's sort of, it's soft, it's not, you know, it's not infrastructure, it's not office space, it's not Ethernet connections. I mean, the one thing the Valley does have, you know, I end up literally, my office is like 19 coffee shops between Mountain View and San Francisco. And if I walk into any of those coffee shops and I just peer into like what's happening in the other conversation, I have the best corporate espionage possible. Like, I mean, everybody is pitching. And you know, the beauty of the Valley to me is just the fact that a few people who started off in that same position actually had success. And then the people who were around them in the same coffee shops say, wait a minute, that guy wasn't that smart. You know, like I remember when he was there and I was doing the same thing. If he can do it, I can do it. There's a lot of that. And I think the nice thing about the Valley is that people who in many cases do invest in the next generation, right? And so one thing I've noticed in other parts of the world is that the sense of community is not nearly as strong, so you don't have a critical mass of people doing stuff. In the Valley, this is like this is the biggest game in town. This is all people want to talk about. This is our gold rush, you know, year in, year out. It's not the case in different places, even other cities in the US. You know, and then the other side of it, I think, is people actually invest in the next generation in mentoring. In other places, what's been amazing to me is that, like, one, you don't have critical mass, and two, like, a lot of people I find actually aren't helping each other, which kind of hurts a little bit, right? Like, and they don't celebrate their own success stories either. It's like, someone made it. Well, that guy was a total douchebag anyway, and like, we didn't really like him, and yeah, you could call that made it, but he cheated his way there. Did you see how he raised money? I mean, that was, I mean, so there's a little bit of that way, and likewise, right? I feel like when I was in Turkey, it was a good example of this. Like, we were going through this office park outside of Istanbul, and of course, everyone built office parks, right? Because that's how you start Silicon Valley, is you build real estate, and then everyone will show up, and innovation will happen. And I was walking through it, and it was pretty amazing, because I looked at this office park building, and it was like, literally, it looked like a law firm office. It was like, you'd walk into a hallway, and there were a bunch of offices on the side. And I was like, well, where's the common space, right? Like, what's the, if you're building this shared incubator, you know, workspace, like, well, where's the shared space? There's no shared space here. And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, you know, why don't you just knock some of these walls down? He's like, but then people can steal secrets from each other. I was like,
so it's a different culture, really.
Like, man, that, you know, if that's where we're coming from, then, you know, the issue here is not going to be that. It's going to be trusting each other.
Yes.
And so, you know, these are soft things that happen over time, and there's always bad stories. I mean, even in the Valley, there's plenty of, I've seen examples of like founders, you know, stealing each other's talent and stealing each other's ideas, et cetera. But the truth of it is that one thing that I love about the Valley is that when we walk around at the end of every meeting, I ask, you know, and someone will ask me, like, what can I do for you? It's a very simple question. It's a very powerful question, right? And I think everyone actually wants to help everyone out because they kind of believe in the karmic value that's going to come back. And I think if we just had that one question at the end of most meetings in most places, you'd probably end up with a much better environment. The other thing that's nice in the Valley is it's cool to start companies. You know, it's cool to be unemployed. It's not that cool to be unemployed in other places. Like, it's like, how are you going to get married, and what are you going to do about the job? When people ask, like, I mean, I literally got asked those questions in a lot of places. Like, well, you know, my mom has been telling me, like, what are you doing? And I mean, it's a real concern, right? So, again, better reason to celebrate your successes. Well, I'm doing this because if that guy can do it or that girl can do it, then, you know, I think I have a shot too.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Do you see any impact yet of the shift to San Francisco and East Bay? How's that impacting the culture in Silicon Valley?
You mean from like the Valley, from like Mountain View, Palo Alto, et cetera?
Yeah, is it having an impact on the community, sort of smallish community aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a community perspective, I think it's just, I mean, the Valley is like, I think in my mind, all those things are all, you know, it's all part of the same place. I think the difference is that San Francisco has become interesting, especially for consumer web stuff. And, you know, part of that makes sense, right? I mean, you have a much more artistic bent in sort of urban areas. In San Francisco, Berkeley is another example of this too. And so things like design matter a lot more for consumer stuff. And you start to see like, you know, new consumer behaviors being engineered and likely coming from, you know, that marriage of tech people and artistic talent. So I think that's why you see sort of like the San Francisco area being interesting. What's interesting for me in terms of when I watch the next evolution is what's happening next. So, you know, a friend of mine is actually trying to build a 3D printer alliance in the East Bay. And you know, I was asking why. Well, one, rents are cheap. But two, I mean, you have the confluence of Pixar's in Emeryville, right, in sort of that area. You have a lot of gaming companies. You have a lot of design orientation. You have a lot of like tech people with, you know, with mohawks and like colored hair. And actually that 3D thinking is actually exactly what you need when you're thinking about bringing stuff into the three-dimensional world. It's that design talent, architects, designers, et cetera, are going to be interesting. So I think that's constantly evolving, but those are like micro things.
We were at the Crunchies last night, just to interrupt you, and they did a head count of how many people were from San Francisco, and I think it was like 80%. There was 20% that weren't from San Francisco, and there was more out-of-towners than the peninsula.
Yeah, I believe.
And I was like, ooh, it's starting to change a lot.
Yeah, yeah, and the Crunchies are also in San Francisco, right?
Yeah.
That certainly helps. That's an awesome venue, by the way.
Yeah. Except when you try and get out of it with all those people.
Yeah, we have an office building in like the Lucas Arts building in the Presidio, and it's just like, it takes a long time to get there, but when you're there, you feel like you should have deep thoughts. And then I have I literally have like R2-D2 next to a statue of him. I have like Darth Vader. We have like the best Star Wars paraphernalia shop. There's some Oscars. Like, it's just.
So anyone got any questions for Saad while he's here?
I'm lost.
So, what skills can one get to become really sharp and, you know, like the story that you told us?
Yeah.
Like what skills that one can acquire?
Yeah. Well, you know, one skill. I mean, you have to acquire a lot, right? Starting with the thick skin, which is more like calluses than it is like acquired. But you know, the thing to me that's very surprising, which I think is actually something that I think about a lot for all of my portfolio companies, is storytelling, and how, you know, I mean, it sounds very basic and it sounds like, but I mean, if you think about what you do as an entrepreneur, you are constantly pitching, right? I mean, you're pitching to employees about why they should quit their day jobs and come do this with you. You're pitching to investors about why they should invest in your company. You know, eventually you're pitching to customers. You know, one day hopefully you'll be pitching to people why your valuation should be so much bigger when you get acquired for gajillions of dollars, or when you start acquiring other companies, right? I mean, you're constantly pitching. And if you think about the most, you know, that is storytelling, right? I mean, it's how can I affect, you know, whatever it is that I see in my vision and get other people to sort of, you know, get excited by the same vision. And so the mechanics of storytelling are actually like things that are not unique to entrepreneurs, right? I mean, there's lots of other places that you can learn from. George Lucas was a pretty good fan. I mean, he was a huge fan of Joseph Campbell. If you guys ever read, you know who Joseph Campbell is, the comparative mythology scholar. I mean, he's literally done the work of like breaking down exactly what are the archetypical stories that, you know, are the bases of religions, and, you know, and sort of like stories that feel like they're stories that we don't have to learn because we already know them. And, you know, so that's a good place to start, those people who actually study that. And I think the other best thing you can do is just constantly pitching, right? Like, and you pitch to everybody. I mean, you pitch to your mom, you pitch to your brother, you pitch to your significant other, you pitch to people in the elevator. You just don't stop, because it's only when you let 1,000 flowers bloom that you figure out which flower actually is the one that seems to really deliver for you. And I can guarantee you, you won't know unless you have that experience. And you don't want to start testing it when when it really matters, right? When you only have one bullet left, you need to know exactly what your story is. You don't want to be testing it at that point. So anyway, always be pitching, and, you know, and if you can really start to dig into like the mechanics of storytelling, I think it's there's places to learn.
Any other questions?
I liked your description of mentoring and the value of that, and we all have little or no time, and so I wondered, you know, throughout your your different paths, how you decide where to mentor and where it makes sense to. What's your selection process for figuring that out?
It's usually who catches me when I'm in my car driving from meeting to meeting. Honestly, it's at the end of the day, I feel like I benefited from other people offering their time to somebody who at that moment in time had zero to offer to them. And it's one of those things where, when you feel like you've experienced that, you want to pay it forward, right? And I think it also goes to the spirit of this community that I was talking about, right? It's like, well, how can I help? I mean, the people ask that question without any expectation of return. And that's, by the way, also when you do that long enough, you actually get far more from it than you give. So I think in that spirit, that's why I do it. In terms of how I pick, usually it's usually at some level who's the most persistent in actually trying. My schedule is a little bit crazy sometimes between meetings and travel and board meetings and putting out fires, and baby is like, it's rocked my world, right? So now when I'm even in those meetings, I'm usually like thinking about, man, can I get some more coffee? But yeah, and a lot of people, the other thing I end up doing is I end up kind of holding office hours around where I am at any given time. And so for the folks who actually make an effort to come out, I'm on one hand flattered that they actually think that I could offer them something that would be that useful. And then it also makes me think, well, I better offer them something really useful, because otherwise, I feel like I'm wasting everybody's time. So usually for me, the way meetings start or meetings end is, okay, I also know that if there's introductions or things that I want to make for people, it's always best to do it right there, because the second you walk out of the meeting, the world changes. So, I'll literally hand people my phone and say, just take these numbers down, take these emails down, and we'll go from there. But
how can you tell when someone pitches to you? When you get excited, what is the trigger that makes you excited and want to follow through?
For me, it's always been about people.
Okay.
It's sort of, I kind of, my lens on investing is like the dream team. That's just how I think of it. And so my bar for any investment is are these people part of the dream team? Are these people that I would gladly go work with and for? And at some level, I don't care what they're doing. Once you meet that bar at some level, and the truth of it is in the Valley, especially for web businesses, if you're starting something, just because I'm starting this, I would say almost 100% of the companies I've invested in have done nothing close to what they thought they were going to do.
The pivot.
If you're investing early enough, but the beauty of that, what I find, it's actually easier to raise capital than it is to find people. So for me, first principles are always okay, are these the people that you feel like are that caliber of folks who not only do I want to invest in what they do now, but I want to invest in everything that they do from now until the end of their career, right, or until I'm gone. So if that's your frame of reference, then you're playing the long game. And so whether we decide to do a wearable computing thing or whether we decide to do anything that's sort of web related, et cetera, those things are constantly evolving. Tech is constantly changing. People can build on top of those things, but what doesn't change are people. And I would say it's actually the hardest thing to do in the Valley right now is find talent. Anyone looking for engineering talent, can tell you the same thing. It's just you can raise money and then you spend 2 years trying to find the right person and still not find them. And so that's why I start there. For me, that's 99% of the battle.
What's it like investing in companies that aren't in the area? Every VC seems to have a different opinion about that.
This is a lot of people have different views on this, and I think there's some people in the room who I know actually spend a lot of time on planes, and I think you're actually getting a sample of those people, sort of a higher sample of those people here than actually exist in the broader community.
Okay.
For a lot of people, they view, and the reason is that in the venture business, everyone believes it's a local business. If you think about it, if I can't pick up the phone and call 5 people who know exactly what you're like on your worst day and what it's like to work with you in the trenches, then I should not be investing. Right? It just, if you don't have that level of comfort with things, then it's probably a very bad idea to be investing. And by definition, getting that kind of familiarity with people requires a local network, a local knowledge base, et cetera. And so, other people have made the point that if you don't have that, you will lose your shirt as an investor in other markets. Then there's complexities of being in other parts of the world, legal structures, et cetera. There's a bunch of other things that happen. So that's why I think people have a bias, and a lot of people in the U.S. or even the Valley will say, "Oh, we won't invest in anything outside of a place that we can drive to within 45 minutes,"
Yeah.
which I think is, and that's in my opinion, a very insular point of view, because what I've learned over time is that innovation happens everywhere. You need a laptop and an internet connection, and you can, it's like Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I can move the world.
So what's your solution to that? If you feel that way, do people then have to move here? Which happens a lot with foreign startups.
I don't have a good solution right now. My solution is like 23C on the plane, like that's sort of. But I think I think it obviously helps to have a local partner, right? In whatever you're doing. As an investor, for me, I've invested. I spend a lot of time in a lot of places, actually, sort of building networks long before I think I'm going to need to actually like pull the trigger and make an investment, right? Because by the time I make an investment, I want to have that same level of familiarity.
Okay.
But I've invested in Europe, I've invested in China, I've invested in some in the Middle East also. In all those cases, what they all had in common was sort of somebody on the team who was an incredibly trusted person. In the Chinese case, it was actually like somebody who spun out of a company that I'm an investor in called Lending Club, which who I knew from the U.S. and then they went to China with an intent of doing something similar. And so like the only way I could possibly feel comfortable investing in a Chinese company would be from that relationship, right? Because we had that connection. But so I think there's always that bond somewhere that's created.
Okay.
And I think we all sort of have different levels of trust from different sources too, right? And so in the Middle East, on one hand, I feel like my local knowledge is probably, it's anecdotal, but I'm not there all the time, which makes a huge difference. But there are a few people for whom, if they said, you really need to pay attention to this, and we're in, and I'm involved, like personally, like with whether it's from a management side or a board side, et cetera, that I would take it incredibly seriously.
So you have local people in those areas that are trusted, and if you're going to invest there, okay.
But the reality is the vast majority of my investments still today are U.S. based primarily. But I've also been, and in the case of these other companies I've invested in, it took me 3-4 years of spending time in a lot of these markets before I actually came to the point where I could even write that first check. So that's the reality of it. What that means for you guys, I think, if you're coming here and thinking about, okay, well, how are we going to? I really do think that model actually, I think there's an incredible arbitrage for a lot of people who come into the Valley. If you can manage to raise money here, you will raise at much better valuations than you will in your home markets. It's just a fact, right? I look at a lot of my Egyptian entrepreneur friends, and some of the folks that I've met, even on this trip and other things, and I think some of those deals that people end up doing are borderline usurious, and it's because they feel like they can, and because there isn't liquidity. But I would challenge you to think about if you can move around and travel, and you think things like AngelList and other stuff that's out there, these markets are a lot more liquid than you think, and so it's not a bad idea to spend a little bit of time out here, if nothing else, just to start to have people get to know you, and because I think if you have a little bit of that leverage in terms of fundraising from here, even a small amount of it, it creates a tremendous amount of leverage when you go back home. And I don't think you have to stay here either, frankly. But that's, and I've had some friends who've actually done that very successfully. Now, some of those people who come out here thinking that they're only going to be here for a little while and go back home, don't go back home. So that's, that's a separate thing. But, if visas allow, and if you can afford to travel, 3 months out here in such a hyper-connected environment, you can, I look at this guy, for instance, that I invested in from Egypt. He hadn't been out here in the Valley. We had a conversation 3 years ago. By the time I met him here, he'd been out here for about 3 months. He had this place wired. I look at his investment syndicate and other things. The way he recruited, especially for people who've sort of had to deal with a scrappy environment outside the U.S., right? I look at, I joke about this all the time. If you drive in Pakistan, you are an entrepreneur, by definition. Have you tried driving on the road? To function in most places, you have to learn how to hustle. So when you bring those skills that everyone naturally has, and you bring them here, it's actually pretty easy to hustle in the Valley. and to like, because there's so many hooks into this ecosystem.
Yeah, that's what happened to me when I came from Ireland, you know. Yeah, I just, like, for a year, just soaked it all up and interviewed all the VCs. It was fabulous. But over there, totally logged out.
Yeah. And by the way, that leverage, when you have it here and you go back, it actually creates a lot of leverage when you go back.
Be a rock star.
You're like, so it's awesome, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
You're a prime example of it right here, and I suspect we're going to have more examples of it in this room.
Any other questions?
What's your worst investment and what did you learn from it?
It's a very fair question. I'm trying to figure out how much of it I want to tell you about. Not because I wouldn't tell you all the details, but because it actually affects you know, the other people that you're talking about in this case. Look, I mean, I've had lots of things that have gone under, right? And I've had some pretty, you know, things that I've been involved with that have been like spectacular failures, right? Like, thankfully not in terms of like we raised $1 trillion and lost it all, but spectacular in like, you know, somebody went to jail, and I mean, you know, so there's things that happen, right? I mean, shit happens, it just does, and you know, what you learn from it is, you know, for me, it reinforces the things that I thought of up front, which are like, man, people really do matter, you know, and you know, I look at even things that we did at Garage, for instance. When I was with Guy, I mean, we invested in like, I feel like we had an index of like some of the, not quite pets.com, like a portfolio of them, but like close, right? I mean, we had companies like Claria and Gator, I don't know if you remember them, but like, you know, they were in the middle of all sort of the behavioral targeting, sort of kind of on the fringe of which side of the law and compliance they all, I mean, you know, I think what you learn in all those things is ideas are cheap, you know, execution is everything, and people, you know, are really, you know, people are the engines of that execution. And so there were things, for instance, that we invested in that looked like they were going to be disasters, right? So we invested in something called a music genome project, which, you know, was a more or less a failed composer from Hollywood who was really passionate about music. His first idea was about creating a genome for, you know, if you like this kind of music, this other music that you may like. He applied it to a bunch of e-commerce companies in '99. And of course, all those e-commerce companies, I mean, it was like a B2B model, and they all went under, and so he had no business. And he had a name for this business, it was called Savage Beast, and it was just like, you know, it was totally wrong. And then he reset and started to change the name to something called Pandora and decided to focus on consumers. And, you know, and again, like, things seem to start to work. And then he gets, you know, sued by the RIAA, the sort of the royalty body in the US for music licensees. And everyone thinks that this guy is done. I mean, he's bankrupt. So he goes from being a film composer to an entrepreneur. And by the way, when he was doing his first model, he couldn't pay his employees for 3 years. Managed to raise money on this new Pandora idea. Then he almost gets shut down by the RIA, becomes basically a lobbyist in DC. Manages to, you know, get legislation passed a little bit differently and sort of tell people why what they're doing is actually crazy. You know, 12 years later is this overnight success called Pandora, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar company. Even as a public company, though, everyone shits on it all the time. It's like, you know, Apple's going to come out with a product that looks just like it. They're dead, and yet they continue to sort of persist. And so what's the story there? And the story there is of people, right? I mean, it's about, in this case, a group of people who are incredibly perseverant and, you know, who sort of executed their way out of a bunch of bad ideas into something that actually worked. And, you know, they happened to catch this thing called the iPhone right in the right moment. And, you know, the rest is sort of fun history. But so, you know, when I think about those things, you know, it just reinforces the things that you know, every time you slip on, you think, no, well, this idea is awesome, or this market is huge. I mean, yeah, those things are right, but guess what? Really smart people want to do really big stuff that matters. And if they do, they find the big markets. They change their existing idea to make that happen. Almost every bad decision I've ever been a part of, even my own startups, has always been people-oriented. Like, well, should I really hire that person? They're really a good fit, but they're cheap. You know, and they're willing to do it. And they're available right now. And, you know, I can get started. I mean, in real time, you know, you sort of, looking back at it, it's all obvious. In real time, it's really hard. But it just, for me, it just made my true north even that more solid, you know, that much more solid.
And so when you're saying, you know, the people are available, but maybe they're not a great fit, you've had experiences with that, and in the long term, does that help cause a failure, or
I mean, now
do you think it's that critical as far as the people you pull on board?
it's everything.
Okay.
I mean, it really is, right? I mean, it's, and I can give you plenty of examples of things that, like, you know, where people have made the wrong choice early on.
Right.
And they, you know, you can lose years of like trying to make it work with the wrong person, and even having everything else, you know, theoretically in place. I mean, it doesn't matter. And I look at even in my own portfolio of things where, you know, you get the right 3 people, and they can outperform the wrong 50 people. And it's just, even from an engineering perspective, right, the pace of innovation or whatever, it's just amazing to watch. You know, you get the right people in the room, and they can move mountains, and they can do it with an incredible amount of leverage incredibly fast. And you pick the wrong people, you have a really high burn. You have like much less time to execute. You have inferior products. I mean, so you know, my point is just that like the right people really matter, and I think if you put that bar out there, people also respond to it too, right? I mean, smart people want to work with other really smart people. So if you have one of the wrong people, you know, people always say like, you know, A people hire A+ people, and you know, B people hire C people, and C people hire D people. You know, I mean, people who are actually doing stuff, they want to work with other people who are like, you know, part of that tribe, and who are people that they want to, you know, aspire to work with. So like attracts like, and so it very quickly compounds. So it's not just about that one person, it's about the culture that you build.
So in Silicon Valley we talk about innovation, but often the results of the so-called investments aren't that innovative. In other words, they don't change the way we live. And I've noted, being an Aussie originally, but obviously feel more European now, that, you know, a place like Australia, which is so isolated from the rest of the world, like I spent most of my life trying to get out of there, that incredible inventions, and they were coming out before the word startup was sort of a well-used phrase, and still does. I know Bill Tye does a lot of investments in Australia now.
He also kite surfs. So
yes, so it's perfect.
Yeah.
But I guess my interest is in these foreign countries that actually sometimes innovation can happen because they're not subject to that group mind that here is like, well, you know, is another Instagram or Pinterest or, you know, again, things that don't really change our lives but could make money. Do you think that also contributes in your experience with foreign
Does the
startups?
nature of the environment change the kind of innovation?
Will actually encourage, because you don't have the group mindset of like, you know, are you a Pinterest or a Facebook or...
Well, what's been interesting for me to watch actually is the group mind is something that now is like totally across international borders, right? Everyone reads the same stuff. Internationally, people are still reading TechCrunch. They're still getting they're reading the same blog. They're getting the same information. You know, they have access to the same, like, you know, whether it's the Facebook Developer Conference or what they're coming out of. I mean, the APIs are the same. And so what's surprising me always is when I go to a new incubator or a workspace, or, you know, sort of see sort of a bunch of innovation coming out of the market, it almost always sounds exactly like the pitches that I get when I'm here. So that's one thing that I always find kind of funny. It's like engineers jamming, they look the same, they talk the same, like, you know, we all nerd out the same way. And the pitches, regardless of where you are, and that's, but you forget for a moment that like, oh wow, I'm in KL. Like, this is kind of, you know, I forget that I'm not like in San Francisco. Flip side of that though is that, you know, there are problems that, what gets me really excited about innovation outside the US is, you know, there are problems that American companies are never going to solve. And they're not going to solve them because they don't understand the customer, they don't understand, you know, sort of the nature of the innovation required to be able to do that. I mean, I look at, Pakistan's a good example of this, right? Like, or, you know, a low-cost handset, a simple thing, right? Like, it's just not a focus here. It's not going to be like, it's just, you know, there's certain kinds of problems where it's the nature of the market, it's the nature of the customer, it's sort of the environment that you're in that's going to dictate where the innovation is going to come from. And I have a thesis that some, you know, some of these innovations that I think are actually going to be massive will never come here, which is why I spend time in other places, right? Because I feel like I know they're going to come from there, and there's no way they can come from here. And, you know, to me, that's what's exciting, is like trying to find those things. And, you know, and anywhere you go, the people are sophisticated about different things. Actually, in Turkey, what I was really surprised about was Even from, in Turkey actually, like I found the tech from a science and tech perspective was actually like comparable, if not better, than stuff I've seen at MIT, Stanford, and Carnegie Mellon, which was surprising to me, right? Like the actual just sheer horsepower of the science that was happening. You know, I think in places like India and Pakistan and sort of South Asia, really figuring out how to deliver to the mass market. And by the mass market, I mean like people, I hate the bottom of the pyramid stuff when people talk about it that way, but like that's literally where most people in the world live. Figuring out how to create solutions to solve, you know, and consumer value propositions for there is a huge market opportunity, and one that will never, that innovation will never come from here. And
because
so,
the pain's not here, right?
the pain's not here, it's not understood, you know, it's like, I used to joke with, you know, with Guy about like, you know, one of Guy's rules at garages that like, well, if I don't use it and I don't understand it, then I'm not gonna invest in it.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Most people, you know, certainly don't walk from like Ethernet connection to like when they complain about, you know, cell phone coverage here. No one builds a base station for them. Yeah. And so, you know, we're spoiled in the Valley. Is my point.
Yes.
I mean, although not from cell phone coverage, by the way. I think we're actually not spoiled at all. I think we're actually backwards, right? I mean, I've been in, I've come off islands in like, you know, the Far East or even like outside of Malaysia or other places and had better connections than I do in Palo Alto on Sand Hill Road or in downtown San Francisco. But my point is that, you know, there's a bunch of things and experiences that you guys probably all cumulatively feel on a daily basis that are things that only you can solve. And that's why it's going to be hard for anyone else to do it. No one else will be able to do it. And I think if you actually bring your thinking and your innovation to those problems, to me, ultimately, those are the biggest things for people to solve. And that's when you're going to get the most leverage, and that's when you're going to build your own homegrown success stories. And hopefully when that happens, people will celebrate them, and you'll contribute to helping the next generation and remember what it was like to be in this position now.
Fabulous. We might wind it up there, Saad, and I'm just going to do my quiz from the VC books that I've got. I've got The Startup Game from Bill Draper. Obviously, he's been in the Valley a long time, and this is a great book. And my question is, what did Saad say an entrepreneur needs to be doing all the time? There were two things.
Pitching.
Yeah, you got it. So that's for you.
I don't think I said it first. You said it first.
No, it's storytelling.
It was the two, pitching and storytelling.
You guys can share the book.
And, oh gee, wasn't there something else you said?
I have no idea.
Okay, I didn't listen. Mental blank, must need lunch. Okay, where has Saad been and invested in companies in the world? Just
China, Kuala Lumpur.
Okay, this is from Harvey from Switzerland. Okay, guys. Well, thank you so much, Saad. It's always a total pleasure.